I'd like to thank you for being here with us today and introduce you to our presenters. We have with us Leanne Kenny. Leanne is a manager of Markmonitor's Global Industry Relations team, and she focuses on the EMEA region. She recently celebrated her 25th anniversary in the domain industry, having worked in mediation, policy, and stakeholder engagement, and she's even been seconded to work in an MP's office on internet governance. She's recently been elected as the registrar representative on the .ie Policy Advisory Committee as well. And next we have with us Chris Niemi, Manager of Strategic Initiatives and all-around domain industry expert. He's also celebrated a recent anniversary, having been in the industry and with Markmonitor for 21 years. And he is a subject matter expert on ICANN's new GTLD program and a thought leader known for providing service and support solutions around domain strategy, disputes, and .brand services. And finally, we have with us Prudence Malinki, Head of Global Industry Relations at Markmonitor. With over a decade of experience in the industry, she has extensive experience in corporate domain portfolio management, registry, registrar, and vendor relationships. And she's also extended the policy and industry outreach of the Markmonitor business and sits on the PIR Advisory Council, NZ Registrars Forum, .SC Registrar Board, and the GNSO Council at ICANN representing the registrars. She's a strong voice within the ICANN registrar stakeholder group, and she's a passionate advocate for Markmonitor clients and their interests, as are Leanne and Chris as well. And so with that, I would like to go ahead and pass off to Leanne Kenny so that she can take you through our agenda today. Thank you, Leanne. Take it away.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to gloss over the fact that having 25 years experience makes me feel very old. But welcome to everyone joining us today for this ICANN recap webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. As you can see from the agenda, we have an awful lot to cover. So I'm not going to spend any more time talking through that. I'm going to pass on to Prudence, who's going to kick us off. Prudence.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Hello, everyone. And thank you so much, Natalie, for the glowing introduction. Just to reiterate, my name is Prudence Malinki. I head up the Global Industry Relations team at Markmonitor. And I'm really happy to join you and have you join us today to talk about all things ICANN 83 and all things Prague Policy Forum meeting. So as you can see from the slide, this was the second opportunity to have a meeting in Prague. Now, for those of you who are well versed of ICANN meetings, I need you to go all the way back to 2012 when the last meeting took place in Prague in June in ICANN 44. So this meeting was well attended, but slightly less attended than the Seattle meeting. As you can see from the slide here, we had 1,321 people in person on site in Prague. This is ever so slightly lower than the Seattle Community Forum meeting, which had 1,336 in-person attendees. Now there's a little bit of a discrepancy, which makes sense with regards to the remote participation. So for Prague and the Prague policy meeting, we actually saw 555 virtual participants engage in the meeting. So clearly policy was very exciting for a lot of people. And this is ever so slightly higher than the 531 that were remotely attending during the Seattle community meeting. Now, what does this mean and where are we going with this? Our next meeting is due to be held in October, and it's going to be the AGM, or the annual general meeting, held in glorious Oman. Now, one of the hot topics you'll see on the slide here was the How We Meet discussion. Now, there's some wicked whispers that the next Oman meeting potentially could be remote. Now, these are just whispers. I can't confirm whether they're true or not, but let's work on the presumption that everything's going on course. So our next meeting will be in beautiful Oman in October this year. Now, to explain a bit more about policy meetings and policy forums, the policy forum is essentially exactly as it says on the tin. It's a meeting specifically designed for all of the policies groups to converge together and get the job done. Now, unlike other meetings, it's the most condensed and concise meeting. This one was 4 days long, but as you can see from the sessions of interest on the slide, there was a lot crammed into the next 4 days. Now, as Leanne was alluding to with the agenda, we have an action-packed agenda for you today. We're going to be talking about PPSAI, we're going to be talking about registry data, we're going to be talking about CCNSO, we're going to be talking about DNS abuse, which never ends, and we're going to hopefully keep you up to date with all the latest movements and developments in all things policy for ICANN 83. So if we can go to the next slide, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to talk all things SubPro. Take over, Chris.
All right. Well, thanks, Prudence, for that warm welcome. Since we last joined our listeners after the Seattle meeting of ICANN 82, a lot of different milestones have been hit in regard to the new GTLD space that's adjacent to the subject and procedures implementation review team's work. Primarily, the most important was that on May 30th, the full Applicant Guidebook, or AGB, as everybody calls it, was the final full draft of it was published for public comment, and that comment is open till July 23rd. The AGB is important because it is sort of like the rule set, the requirements of what it takes to apply for a new GTLD in the next round. So that was big news. The IRT has been working on that for 2+ years and put in thousands of hours across hundreds of folks working hard on that. So we appreciate all their work and getting closer and closer to the finish line. The other event that happened recently, ICANN is working on changing the next round base registry agreement wording. So every registry operator, when they sign to become a registry operator with ICANN, signs an agreement. That's a 10-year long agreement, and it specifies all the requirements they will have to meet and so forth. So it will be somewhat different than the 2012 rounds based RA. So be on the lookout for that. That also is in public comment through July 14th. I'll be likely publishing some of my thoughts around both of these activities later in the month. So be on the lookout for that. Next slide, please. Bringing us back to Prague, in ICANN 83, the SubPro IRT had 2 distinct work sessions. But before I get into that, I just wanted to give a shout out to the ICANN staff who were hustling all around the convention center all week. The ICANN folks who'd been working on the next round, Lars and Marika and others, had attended, I believe, 9 different sessions where they gave updates. One of the areas that kind of had a little fire, or as Prudence might say, a little spice, was in the GAC, the Governmental Advisory Committee. They had a couple of sessions directly about the new GTLD program. And in one of them, the GAC discussion on new GTLD program, the US GAC representative actually made a comment that stated directly for the record that I will read it directly, that the US has reservations around the next round of GTLDs, worried that this would lead to more DNS abuse for everyone on the internet, and that the United States is of the view that we should not expand the DNS too broadly like was done in 2013. So as you can imagine, that could be viewed as a somewhat incendiary comment. It kind of had people bubbling around. Even the GAC chair, Nico Caballero, the next day made a comment directly about it. And he said, people have been saying weird things at the coffee station about these sorts of things, but he wanted to go on the record that, for the record, the GAC is not intending to stop the next round of new GTLDs. So that was kind of a mini tempest in a teapot as far as these things go. So ICANN is never boring. Leanne's going to talk a little bit more about some of these GAC effects on policy as she discussed the GAC communique later. Next slide. Another important meeting that is talking about an important part of the applicant journey for every application in the next round is going to end up going through what's called string similarity evaluation to make sure that strings are not visually confused. As part of the application process, applied for strings and their variants are going to be compared and evaluated against other applied for strings and their variants, existing GTLDs, existing CCTLDs, block names, and a few other classes of different types of strings. So as you would imagine, this might be a fairly complex undertaking. It's going to end up being done by what's called a string similarity evaluation panel. They're going to do a manual review, but ICANN has also made a tool that's going to take part in this process directly that'll help them kind of make those comparisons. So as you can see on the slide, this is a pretty in-depth process. And it's going to be an important part of trying to confirm if strings can be similar to other strings, which can lead to potential contention sets and other matters. One part of the community session in that meeting was people in the community did want to ask ICANN to have access to the tool in question, and ICANN wasn't quite sure if they're going to be able to make it depending on deadlines and how they could access it, as I believe it's an open source application. So hopefully there'll be more to come on that in the future. Next slide. So back to the discussion of the other IRT, SubPro IRT meeting, which was about reach. I can give some updates on its various programs that are part of the overarching new utility program next round. One of these is again about the RSP, or Registry Service Provider Evaluation Program. That program, their first application window ended on May 20th. And you can see that, let's see, about 24 organizations who applied as an RSP are conditionally or fully approved. And there's about 70 applications for the actual RSP application that are drafted or initiated so far. So again, this is so that people can get pre-evaluated, so that during the application process, applicants can select an RSP as part of the process to make sure that they'll meet their technical requirements. One point of notice was in the ICANN 83 prep week session before the meeting happened, ICANN did give a program status update, and RST, which is Registry Service Testing, a subset of the RSP program, was identified as a red or high risk area of potentially not getting done on the time frames that ICANN needed. But ICANN is committed to mitigating any of that risk and trying to apply more resources, so they should have more information on that and work through that in this coming summer. Next slide. Okay, all right, the ASP, so the Applicant Support Program, this is again ICANN's effort at trying to reach parties who are perhaps in underserved regions in the Global South and other places who may not have access to the resources or ability, kind of understanding to be able to apply on their own. And so it's been, the ASP allows the applicants to it to have potential discounts on their application or access to various pro bono services. So as you can see, there's about 42 applications for the ASP so far that have been drafted or initiated, and 4 applications have been formally submitted. Regionally, you can see on the map there that the leader is the North America region with 17, followed by APAC with 10, and Africa with 7. The GAC also is a little bit worried in this area about, they were hoping that more applicants would be taking part in this program. So as this program ends in November of this year, the GAC is sort of requesting ICANN consider reviewing their efforts so far, as there's only 5 months left to continue this program, to see if they can refocus and make sure that they're hitting the right target regions and folks who should be utilizing this program. So there'll be more to come on that about more access to engagement and so forth. Next slide. ICANN continues to bang the drum on the next round and has been doing numbers of engagement efforts throughout the year. We've already got through, I believe, 192 events just through May, and I believe that's even more than all of ICANN did last year. And again, as you can see on the right side of the screen there's been 61 different ASP engagement efforts. So again, ICANN's really trying to reach out to those parties who might be able to take part in that process. Next slide. So again, ICANN is really doing everything it can, and based on its efforts, it's continuing to show that it's serious about meeting the deadlines it's set. So as you can see on the top, the most important, again, is what we referred to earlier, was the publication of the guidebook. And once that is approved and accepted by the board in December, the round can launch 4 months after that point, and that's where we're getting that April of 2026 estimate. And then as you can see in the second row of the top table, ICANN still has to do a lot of work in order to be able to programmatically deliver the services around the actual window, to be able to receive applications, to do all the associated work. So they're continuing to work diligently on getting all those efforts continuing so that we can make the next round happen. Next slide. And then lastly, from my point of view, the Brand Registry Group, or BRG, had a session. Again, these are folks that have applied for their own registry, their own .brand closed registry or are interested in applying. And they took part in a session that was hosted by the Registry Stakeholder Group that was called BRG.Brand Use Cases and Insights for the Next Round. Again, they worked with ICANN in this session. ICANN gave a lot of information about the applicant journey of how a TLD sort of works its way through the processes and how that sort of kind of interact with and affect a .brand applicant. So one important point that came out of that was that for some time ICANN's been discussing, in addition to the $227,000 application fee, different types of GTLD applications will have additional fees to continue their evaluation process. Initially, the fee was considered to be as high as something like $5,000 to $10,000, but now ICANN has landed on using their cost recovery model, a smaller amount of just an additional $500 to process a specification 13 application. So not nothing, but pretty low compared to the overarching application fee. So that was good to hear. Secondarily, Sky, the British media company, has a .brand.sky. They gave some use case examples that I hadn't heard of specifically before. For instance, they're doing some clever things with subdomains. So they're using the domain @.sky and then putting a subdomain in front of it. So things like bus.at.sky or food.at.sky, which are internal pages that they're using for their employees or on their business campus to find out about like bus schedules or cafeteria menus and things like that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting usage that I hadn't heard of a ton previously. Sky also apparently has a lot of partnerships with third parties where they do sort of co-branded events and activities and campaigns and so forth. So in all of those, they're utilizing the contact.sky email address so that they can confirm that those messages that are going out to their end users are safe, utilizing all the security protocols that they would like to have to make sure everybody is communicated with in a healthy fashion. It was a great session. It was great to see the and then lastly, regarding the BRG itself, when we talked last after Seattle, the executive director role had been open and they were interviewing for it. And then shortly before INTA, earlier in May, they announced that they have selected a new executive director. Her name is Jennifer Gore. She's well known and has a long history in the domain space. She's worked at companies like ICANN and Web.com and others. So we're excited to welcome her back to the space and to see how she'll interact with the BRG and with the folks in the community going forward. So welcome, Jennifer. And with that, I will pass it to Leanne.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, Chris. So I am going to take you to the world of the CCNSO, which is the Country Code Names Supporting Organisation. So this is the space where the CCTLD registries, so the country code registries, discuss all of the topics of interest to them. So I'm going to kick off with a little bit of internet governance. Internet governance, multi-stakeholder model, the WSIS plus 20 review was peppered throughout quite a few sessions. So the CCNSO had a session focusing on 20 years since the WSIS was first established. So that's the World Summit on the Information Society. And about 20 years ago, governments realized that the potential really of emerging technology and also the growing digital divide and the lack of governance structures around the emerging technology and the internet. And so the UN convened the World Summit, and it happened in 2 phases. And out of it came a number of what they called action lines. And these were really recommendations on things to consider in regards to the information society. So it was where the Internet Governance Forum was formed, which is an annual event that takes place to discuss all sorts of issues like the digital divide, accessibility, digital skill, things like that within a multi-stakeholder forum, and also where multi-stakeholderism was born. So in this particular session, we had 3 CCTLDs, one from Cabo Verde, we had FNIC from France, and also Taiwan, .tw from Taiwan, talk about how they incorporate internet governance principles and also multi-stakeholderism into the way they either run the registry or initiatives that happen within the registry. So that might be facilitating or coordinating a regional or national internet governance forum, or it may be incorporating a multi-stakeholder model in the way that they develop policy. So that was a nice session to kind of demonstrate how that multi-stakeholder model, which is obviously very relevant to ICANN because it's the model that is used within the ICANN community, and how that kind of permeates throughout the internet community. The next session I wanted to highlight was the joint session between the CCNSO and the GNSO Registry Stakeholder Group. So this was quite often the CCTLD world and the GTLD world kind of operate quite separately. Bodies develop their own policy. They often have to take into consideration their own national legislation, whereas the GTL space very much sits within the kind of ICANN sphere. So this session was looking for areas of commonality between those two groups of registries, and there were quite a few. So, for instance, how ICANN is run, ICANN planning, things like DNS abuse, internet governance. This was quite an interesting one because internet governance is historically a CCTLD initiative, but actually the Contracted Parties House has produced a statement in support of the multi-stakeholder model and also committing to supporting it and recognising the value of the multi-stakeholder model. So the session was really around looking for ways to share information, to work together, to share best practice, and also on certain issues have a collective registry voice when they're putting forward input. So that was a super interesting and valuable session. I'm just going to pick out a couple of other sessions from the CCNSO. One was on financial contributions. So the CCNSO, I think at the Istanbul meeting, had reconvened a working group to look at the financial contributions that CCTLDs make to ICANN. They had a set of principles already, but they felt it was timely to review it, also in the light of CCTLD contributions actually declining in recent times. So there was a presentation from ICANN on shared costs. So things that ICANN provides or delivers for the CCTLD community that costs money. And the working group also presented a slightly amended set of guidelines and principles around financial contributions and a banded model of a kind of tiered model of financial contributions, which was based on domains under management. So if you have above 10 million domains under management, you sit right at the top of the band and contribute the most. And obviously, if you have very few domains under management, you sit right at the bottom. And then there were tiers in between. And the majority of the CCNSO members seemed to support those principles. So that will be interesting to see how that moves forward. CCNSO always has a CCTLD news session. And so there were presentations from various registries, Australia, Guatemala, Korea and Canada. And there was also a presentation from China on mitigating DNS abuse, which I'll talk a little bit later when I cover the DNS abuse sessions that again kind of ripple through all of the constituencies. And then the meeting ends for the CCNSO with a council meeting. Just one thing really to highlight from this meeting, and that was around reviews. So ICANN is committed by its bylaws to carry out a accountability and transparency review. It's had 3, and ATRT4 is now overdue, but the board has paused that review because I think they've seen some issues with the way the review process works, and their thinking is that maybe they would fix the issues, then carry out the review, rather than do the review knowing there are issues to then fix the issues. There's a mix of views on this in the CCNSO, I would say. They fully support the continuous improvement framework, but there are some that feel that ICANN being in breach of its own bylaws is not particularly great, and they would like to see the ATRT4 review done and then have another look at the review process as a whole following that. Others disagree with that. So again, that will be interesting. It also came up in the GAC communique, which I'll cover a little bit later. But that's it from me on the CCTLD side. And I think I'm passing over now to Prudence.
Hi, and I managed to press the wrong button and almost turn off my camera. Professional. Thank you so much for that update, Leanne. And I just want to reiterate a couple of things and really salient points that Leanne was making about the developments and discussions that were happening at that meeting. Please pay close attention to the outreach that the RYSG was doing with CCNSO. This is very important for that unified registry voice. And also one of the reasons why we as Markmonitor pay close attention to the CCNSO world is because a lot of factors and things that impact CCTLDs will later then filter down to GNSO and GTLDs at a later stage. So it's a really good way to keep abreast of developments and keep up to date with regards to everything that we're doing. It's a really great way to kind of forecast what's going to be coming around the corner and around the bend, and also making sure that the GTLD registries via GNSO and the CCTLD registries via CCNSO are communicating with each other, means that everyone can share their experience and hindsight. And essentially, this is what the multi-stakeholder model is all about. There, I said multi-stakeholder model. I can't say the word multi-stakeholder model without saying the word multi-stakeholderism, and I can't say the word multi-stakeholderism without saying the words internet governance. Now that I've said all of these words, I'm going to talk about RDRS and change tag and talk all things registrant data. So what I'd like to do is talk to you all a little bit about what RDRS is, also what RDRS isn't, but then take you down a journey of where we're going with RDRS and hopefully keep you up to speed with what's to come and what we're expecting and the outcomes from RDRS. So RDRS, besides being 4 letters, it's the Registrant Data Request Service. And this is basically a unified, standardized request service to ask for registrant or registration data. What is it not? A standardized system to provide that said registrant data. The registrars still retain the ability to use their discretion to provide that registrant data upon receipt of the notification via the RDRS service. Now, what was the purpose of RDRS? Because there was indeed a purpose. Now, lovingly referred to by some as an experiment, RDRS essentially is a 2-year project to collate data. Why? Because of SSAD. What's SSAD, I hear you ask? In fact, I'm pretty sure that was asked that. SSAD is the System for Standardized Access or Disclosure, again to do with registrant data. Originally, SSAD, when created, was not able to be implemented on an as-is basis due to cost implications, and so the RDRS was born to develop and find out ways to influence what SSAD needs to look like and to shape the future of SSAD, should there even be an SSAD moving forward. Now, during the ICANN meeting in Prague, the standing committee did converge together to talk all things RDRS. Now, they are a standing committee, so what does that mean? It means they are not able to create policy. What they are aiming to do is to generate a report. And this report, hopefully, if we have a look at the next slide, shall be available for the August month. So we're looking at a timeline now for which all of this data that's been collected should be conveyed into a report in August. Why does this matter? Let me explain. This report basically will shape the future of how we have standardized requests for registrant data. This is one of the hottest topics right now, besides DNS abuse, the gift that never ends or stop giving. So with RDRS and with this report, it's going to be so vitally important that you take the time to read this report and have your say as to what you think and how you think the future of standardized requests for registrant data should look like, because it will impact you, because at some point you may need registrant data, and to figure out a way to do that would be really helpful. Now, was RDRS perfect? Not necessarily. It's been noted that RDRS was voluntary or opt-in, which meant that not all registrars signed up to the pilot or the experiment, as it's lovingly referred to. And what this meant was that sometimes if the registrar wasn't signed up to the pilot, then you weren't able to utilize RDRS to make that standardized request. However, that being said, some of the largest registrars on the planet did step up and did engage with the pilot, therefore making access to a whole plethora of domain names. So the study with regards to how many domains you could request data for was still valid to a certain degree, but it wasn't mandatory. Also, there was a notable withdrawal from one registrar as well from the project. However, that was being noted that that was soon or around the time during the Istanbul period, during the Istanbul meeting, where it was declared during one of the sessions there that they had actually collated enough data to essentially start working on that report. So keep your eyes peeled for August for this report, which will talk about the future of what SSAD Light or SSRDRS shall look like. And make sure that you have your say. And here at Markmonitor, we will keep you completely up to date and abreast of all developments relating to this important topic. Now, before I segue to the next topic, which I obviously want to do, I just want to remind everyone that this is an interactive session, so don't be shy. If I've said an initialism that doesn't make sense, if my dulcet tones are just not dulcet enough for you, or if it's just that my English accent is a little bit grating, ask a question into the chat and we can check in real time and keep you up to speed with any questions that you may have. So please do feel free to use the question chat area to ask any questions, but there will be a question section at the end of the session today. All right, so let's segue on to the next topic and talk about all things PPSAI. Okay, so for those of you who love an initialism or an acronym, PPSAI stands for the Privacy and Proxy Services Accreditation IRT. Now try saying that 5 times as fast. Wow. Now, PPSAI is an IRT. What does that mean? It is not creating new policy. So it's really important that I make that distinction. What it is worth noting is that the Privacy Proxy IRT is dealing with implementation of an accreditation process for privacy and proxy service providers. Now, they're going to be reviewing a number of threshold questions, which I'll show you on the next slide. But essentially, they're not creating any new policy or they're not creating any new frameworks. As you can see here from the purpose of their work, if there are any issues relating to implementation that arise through these discussions, they will be escalated up to council, who will then resolve those matters for them, rather than them creating new policy or trying to resolve them with innovative ways that may be against the bylaws. Just saying. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, we can have a look at those threshold questions. So as you can see here, we have the 3 major threshold questions. During the meeting in Prague, the second category was the questions that were explored in depth. Excuse me. And this was the implementation models. So these are basically the accreditation models to be applied to privacy and proxy service providers. And the reason why this is exciting is because there was 3 models that were being proposed during the Prague meeting, including a fast track model and also a lightweight model. Now, these will have varying different complexities and obligation requirements as to whether it's mandatory or opt-in, and these were discussed at length. However, one of the things that I really want to draw to your attention today isn't that of what was discussed during the Prague meeting, which is category 2, but category 3. And this is quite an important thing. So this IRT is looking at ways to implement an accreditation model to do with privacy and proxy service providers. However, it's worth noting that there are a number of moving parts that will impact the ability to do implementable, to make implementability a factor for accreditation models. So things such as RDRS and the outcomes of RDRS, so for example, what the SN and what the request system looks like, this could potentially impact the implementability of an accreditation system for a privacy proxy service provider. This, in conjunction to the registration data policy as well, this can also have a practical impact to how the team or the IRT team implement an accreditation model, if they're able to implement an accreditation model at all. So these are things to pay attention to and focus on, which is really very interesting. Now, the team will continue to discuss PPSAI, so these are going to be ongoing sessions, but it was a really lively and topical discussion point during the Prague meeting. Now, PPSAI is going to be ongoing and we'll give you continued updates relating to this topic and other IRTs that are on the move at the moment. But I want to segue now to the geopolitical update, because what did I say before? Multi-stakeholderism, internet governance, multi-stakeholder models. So I'm going to hand over to Leanne, who's going to talk all things geopolitics. Leanne.
Thank you very much, Prudence. Yeah, this is the thing that I love talking about the most. I'm going to treat you guys to a little bit more on WSIS and internet governance. So this session was a community discussion on the WSIS Plus 20 review, which will be taking place a little bit later this year. It was a super interesting session. So it started with a presentation from the GNSO, and they had mapped the work of the GNSO to some of the relevant action lines that came out of the WSIS to put some evidence and demonstrate how that multi-stakeholder model actually is working in practice. So I'm not going to go through all of the action lines, so don't panic. But there's one around access to knowledge. So the example was given around the GNSO promoting linguistic diversity on the internet. Confidence and security was demonstrated by the work in developing policies around DNS abuse. And diversity and local content is demonstrated by the community's support of IDNs. So it was a really nice presentation around how those action lines actually can have an impact, a positive impact on how the internet is actually governed. SOC also gave a presentation around their preparation for the WSIS review. They kind of gave a warning around not relying on arguments from the past in terms of supporting the multi-stakeholder model, and that we actually do need some kind of tangible evidence and case studies to demonstrate that model is working. So that kind of fitted very nicely with the examples given from the GNSO. ICANN talked about their engagement in this space. They have a whole knowledge hub on their website. They're hosting webinars, participating in webinars, and also providing input into consultation responses and papers. So if you do want to get involved in that, then obviously take a look at the ICANN website. The UK government also provided some insight into their preparation for the review. So their message really was around not taking the multi-stakeholder model for granted. There are governments who would prefer not to have a multi-stakeholder model and have much more control over the space, and also sort of reiterating that the technical community has a key role to play in providing input into the review. They're also pushing for a permanent mandate for the Internet Governance Forum. And that technical community voice brings me on nicely to the TCCM, which is the Technical it's a Technical Community Coalition for Multi-Stakeholderism. And that was a group that was established by a few CCTLDs in preparation for the review to make sure that the technical community voice is fed into that process. That group is open for anyone from the technical community. Markmonitor is a member, and they're doing a fantastic job in terms of coordinating input, responding to consultations on behalf of the group, and also making sure the group is kept up to date with developments in that area. And then I'm going to move on to another session, which was Europe Space. So on the ICANN agenda, there is always a session that's dedicated to discussing issues, regulatory topics that are specific to the region in which that meeting is being hosted. So we were in Prague. This one was about Europe. So we had to start with NIS2. And so there was a brief update on NIS2 in relation to Article 28, which deals with registration data. So I think it said 9 or 10 of the member states have transposed the directive into law, which means that the others are now under infringement procedure by the European Commission. But I'm sure you've heard this before. Not everyone is implementing this in the same way. So, for example, .be, which is Belgium, already has written into their national law that requests for registration data will be responded to within 24 hours. That's not in the directive. That's just already in their national law. Then you have Denmark. So .dk, originally their bill required verification of email address and telephone number. And this week we learned that an amendment had been accepted for that. So that would be either. So there's no doubt that Article 28 will be implemented slightly differently across the member states. One thing that came up in relation to NIS2, which I hadn't been aware of before, was the European Commission calling for a multi-stakeholder forum on internet standards. So this was met with some confusion in the room, because if you've been listening, there are lots of multi-stakeholder forums already in existence. So this is specifically to provide guidance on how to implement the recommendations around IPv6, email security, DNS security, and routing security. But lots of people in the room feel that we already have, as a community, lots of forums to be able to discuss those particular topics, like RIPE, NCC, ICANN, Internet Governance Forum. So there's a little bit of confusion around what that forum is actually for. That session also talked about Web 4. Now, I've only just really got to grips with Web 3, and now they're discussing Web 4. But the European Commission had a conference, a 2-day conference back in April, which was talking about Web 4. So this is the idea of how things like AI, Internet of Things, blockchain, how they communicate with each other and how they blend with the physical and virtual worlds, and also the impact that potentially will have on the existing internet. There was a lot of talk about sandboxes. So sandboxes are closed, safe spaces in which you can test out ideas and in a safe space. There was a suggestion that they were going to apply that to internet governance. They use them for regulation and technology, but that doesn't really sit very well with the open multi-stakeholder dialogue of internet governance. So that was a little bit confusing. They also talked about EU digital strategy, which is focused on reinstating Europe as a leader in digital affairs. UK crime and policing bill, which acts as a backstop if suspensions are not carried out voluntarily by registries and registrars where a domain's being used for criminal activity, and the Cyber Resilience Bill, which sounds very broad, lots more work to do on fine-tuning the definitions in there. But within that, there'll be a requirement. There's a proposal for a requirement to actually report a cyber security incident within 24 hours rather than 72. So that's a whistle-stop tour through some of the regulatory issues happening in Europe And I will now pass over to Prudence, I think.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Multi-stakeholderism, internet governance, multi-stakeholder model. Let's move on to all things registration data policy. Now, this is another IRT group, which means what? That's right, not creating new policy, guys. They're not there to create new policy. Implementation and review teams are there to implement existing recommendations and policies, right? So, no new policy. However, this team was very focused during the Prague meeting, and they were talking specifically about urgent requests. Now, I need to circle back on urgent requests because during the RDRS discussion, what I didn't mention, which I can happily mention now, is that we currently have two different work streams. One work stream is dealing with this topic here, which is urgent requests and what an urgent request response time looks like and what responses to urgent requests look like. But the other, which is equally as interesting, if not more so, is a work stream held by the PSWG, which is a subdivision of the GAC, looking specifically at the authentication methods for those who are submitting urgent requests. Now, those authentication methods will involve law enforcement agencies. So they're coming up with ways to verify and validate and authenticate requests that are urgent that come from law enforcement before they come to registrars. So we already know that it's a legitimate request when it comes into us, which is absolutely fascinating if you are a dork like me. Anyway, back to the IRT. So this IRT, what I want you to do is focus very closely on this graphic. In the center, you will find the wonderful holistic areas in which the IRT are all getting along and making sense. These are things such as let's create and avoid creating a policy that can be abused, but let's also develop a secure and practical and abuse-resistant process, right? This is all pretty much normal stuff, which is great. However, what I also want you to pay attention to is the stuff on the left and the stuff on the right, because this is where members of the IRT are diverging and not quite coming together. And these are things such as how long to respond to urgent requests. And you can see from this graphic here that you have huge sways and kind of differences in opinion, with some that I believe 24 hours should be reasonable, and some believe it should be within minutes, within moments, within seconds, faster. So the team and the IRT will have to be reviewing and kind of moving past and moving through these topics. Now, during the ICANN meeting, if we move to the next slide, there were 4 questions that were considered during the ICANN meeting that you can see here. And as you can see by the nature of these questions, it is nigh on impossible that they're going to have resolutions to such complex questions by the end of the Prague meeting. So it will come as no surprise that this IRT shall continue for several more meetings, and they'll be continuing to discuss and hopefully resolve the issue of urgent requests whilst the PSWG comes up with their amazing authentication model, which I can't wait to see. Okay, so let's move on and talk about something a little different. And I want to hand back to Leanne, who's going to talk all things DNS abuse. Take the floor, Leanne.
Thank you, Prudence. Something else very close to my heart, DNS abuse. So this is another thing that permeates through lots of the constituencies within ICANN. So we saw from we had a presentation from .cn, China Registry in the CCNSO around how they are mitigating DNS abuse, specifically phishing. So they have suspended 450,000 domains, and they're seeing a huge increase in the use of AI in relation to phishing campaigns. The DNS Abuse Standing Committee, which is again within the CCNSO, was looking at online scams and financial crime in the context of DNS abuse, because there's quite a bit of overlap with phishing. The Contracted Parties House also had a discussion around ideas for future policy development work that they could look at. So that was things like looking at domains in a registrant's account. So when you receive a DNS abuse report, you would then investigate the other domains. So that's kind of what NetBeacon Institute white paper was referring to as an associated domain check, and in the contracted parties house session they were referring to it as looking at reseller agreements and whether regulatory clauses could be entered into the terms of service to give them responsibility for mitigating DNS abuse too, best practices for reporting phishing. And the next steps on that are to produce some output documents. The GAC had presentations from the NetBeacon Institute with regards to their white paper, also the host registry.cz, and Interisle presented their phishing report from 2024. The GAC were particularly interested in the NetBeacon recommendations for potential areas of policy development. There were 5. The GAC are particularly interested in the associated domain check, and also a suggestion that you could add friction into the bulk registration process for new registrants. So that will come up in the GAC communique a little bit later. And then the GNSO did a session on dealing how they had a panel and they had some scenarios for DNS abuse reports. And the panel had to basically say how they would respond to that particular report. I don't think there was a single example where they would all do the same action. And it ranged from suspension to no action to I will investigate and I would ask for more information. So that shows the complexity and how challenging it is to deal with DNS abuse reports. And with that, I will pass back, I think, to Prudence.
Thank you so much, Leanne. Okay, so I'm going to talk about all things Latin script PDP. Firstly, I have to apologize, guys. We are going to run over our allocated time because there was just so much policy, so much excitement, and so much to share with you. So if you do have to dip at the top of the hour, we will be providing you with a copy of the recording of the webinar. And again, if you do want to reach out and have any questions in the interim, feel free to ping all of the team on gir@markmonitor.com, so you can always still stay in touch. Now, back to LD PDP, or the PDP formerly known as LSD PDP. So this is where you have a decision to make, a determination where you have an ASCII and a Latin script diacritic TLD that coexist at the same time, how they get allocated and what to do. And it's where to delegate. Now, the team is comprised of some of the most knowledgeable experts in the field and led by the wonderful Michael Bowland, who I am a big fan of. So big shout out, Michael. And basically, originally, this PDP was looking at questions such as what's in scope and what's out of scope. However, if we move to the next slide, basically, this team has been looking at the EPDP IDN phase 1 recommendations. And during the meeting, they were kind of going through recommendations line by line to see which ones were applicable and relevant to the discussions of this group. Now, on this slide, you can have an example of an ASCII TLD, which has to be the base on the left-hand side, and then the Latin script diacritic version on the right-hand side. And the group is looking at situations as how and when to delegate when these two come into coexistence, which is quite exciting. So they've previously looked at and explored when and what's in scope and what's out of scope. And basically, they've completed all of the phase 1 recommendations of the IDN EPDP during that session. Now, the reason why I sound so excited and so pleased about it is because this PDP is the second PDP that I've been on, the other one being the Chancellor's PDP, that is the definition of efficient. So if you have a look at the next slide, I will tell you about how quick these timings are and how they are to time. So we're looking at January 2027 to have the actual report ready for GNSO Council and the final report being open for public comment in February 2026. So we're looking at very tight and very efficient timelines. And the wonderful news is that this group is working to time, which I'm not going to take all of the credit for, but I'm just saying I'm 2 for 2. That's all I'm saying. And also I'm GNSO Council liaison on this group. So I'm just saying, yeah, take Okay, so if you do have any questions about the LDPDP, always reach out and ask and let us know. Other than that, you're looking at the timings there. So you'll have the first report coming out for public comment in February as always, please take a look and let us know your thoughts and make sure that you make a comment about the future of it. Now, I'm going to start wrapping up to take us home, and I'm going to hand back over to Leanne, who's going to talk all things GAC communique. Leanne?
Thanks, Prudence. Okay, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of things on the GAC communique. So Prudence talks about RDRS. The GAC very strongly feel that that should be mandatory for registrars. And I think they would appreciate some of Prudence's efficiency regarding urgent requests, because they would also like more progress to be made on urgent requests, especially before the next round of new GTLDs. They did provide some advice to the board, which was around those things I mentioned on the Net Beacon Institute white paper. So that relates to bulk registration and also associated domain checks. Now, GAC advice means that the ICANN board has to take that into account, and they also have to report back to the GAC if they decide not to proceed with the advice. So it'll be interesting to see how that moves forward. In terms of new GTLDs, Chris covered the ASP, so the Applicant Support Program. The GAC were also keen on making sure that they were ready and prepared for Reveal Day, which is when ICANN publishes all of the applications so that they can be ready to put in a GAC early warning or GAC advice if they want to object to any of the applications. And then just lastly, just pick out ATRT4. They, together with the sort of flagged that as an issue together with the CCNSO. And essentially the message there was, please sort this out and move forward. So that's it from me. I think I'm handing back to Chris now.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Leanne. So at Markmonitor and our Global Industry Relations team, we try to advocate on behalf of our customers, and we're also a lonely and like company. So whenever possible, we encourage folks to take part in the ICANN community. So if you do want to get involved, if you're interested in intellectual property issues, the intellectual property constituency, or IPC is for you. If you want to take part in the commercial interests of the internet and of the broader community, take part in the business constituency or the BC, or as I noted previously, if you have a .brand GTLD or are interested in applying for one and want to get involved, join the brand registry group with some like-minded folks. So we're happy to help you get plugged in, get you connected, and get you contributing and taking part in the policy space. So with that, I'll pass it to Prudence.
Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today to give us, to let us share with you our recap of all things policy and Prague. As I mentioned and alluded to right at the start of the webinar, the next meeting is going to be scheduled for October, and we will love for you to join us. So one of the things that we do is we attend these meetings for you, but what we would love is for you to join us. And if you are in attendance at an ICANN meeting, please reach out to us and say hi, and allow us to take you to dinner, allow us to show you the ropes, allow us to organize your schedule in the app, which is pretty handy. But this will be a really good opportunity for you to come and meet us and come hang out with us and spend some time with us. But I just want to take the time to say thank you so much for joining us today on the ICANN recap webinar. It's really appreciated. And thank you for staying with us.
As Prudence said, we really appreciate you being here with us today to learn about what happened at ICANN 83 in Prague. We hope to see you in October for our next ICANN recap webinar. Take care, everyone. Thank you again. Goodbye.